call it the Great War. We who have lived through it now know it as the greatest of all wars, and the end is not yet in sight. Mankind has long talked of the end of war. This may well be the end of war, and the end of mankind too. For this war, which many had hoped would be the shortest in history, has now stretched through 5 bitter, desolate, and desolating years, and the destruction has increased each terrible year. Not one of us in the United States has escaped dreadful hurt. 35 million are dead, blasted by atom bombs, burned by deadly radiation, consumed by man-made disease. As many more are wounded or sick. All of us are hungry.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. Episode 3. World Aflame. The year is 1947. Fighting breaks out between Arab and Jewish communities throughout Mandatory Palestine following the United Nations General Assembly vote adopting Resolution 181, a 2-state partition plan for the territory. British military forces, which are responsible for the territory, abandon any attempts at peacekeeping and withdraw. The United States House of Representatives votes for citations of contempt of Congress against 10 Hollywood screenwriters and directors who refuse to cooperate with the House of Un-American Activities. The following day, they are blacklisted by the major Hollywood studios, which also institute loyalty oaths for all employees. Aung San and other members of the Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League, which had recently won elections for the soon-to-be independent nation of Burma, are assassinated by men in army fatigues who burst into a meeting and open fire. Former Prime Minister Yu Saw is convicted of the plot and hanged, but the gunmen are never identified. World Aflame, the Russian-American War of 1950, was written by Leonard, Engel, and Emanuel, and first published in the United States by Dial Press. The World Aflame is presented as a report to the American people. Its author, Ed Craig, is called to a meeting with the Secretary of War, who shows him a program for a 5-year effort designed to help America win the ongoing war against the Soviet Union. The plan is described as a total war that will effectively militarize every aspect of American life and production. The Secretary emphasizes that the public needs to believe and contribute to the plan, otherwise the survival of America itself is in doubt. He also suggests it should be written in a similar manner to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Fireside Chats. The report starts with Craig recounting working in a newsroom on articles about American and Soviet planes exchanging fire over the Black Sea, before he lays out the geopolitical history that led up to that moment. The earliest point of contention is when American and British forces stationed in Turkey and Soviet forces stationed in northern Iran begin accusing each other of incursions. Tensions rise until both sides have given their military shoot-to-kill orders. 2 American planes are shot down by the Soviets, who claim they strayed near Baku, a charge the American government denies. This leads to a dogfight over the Black Sea, with each side again accusing the other of violating the border. The United States demands an apology and indemnities from the Soviet Union, and threatens it will declare a state of war if they do not comply. When the Soviet Union does not reply, the United States attacks, dropping nuclear weapons on 143 cities, described as, quote, every large city or industrial center in European Russia, the southern Urals, and eastern Siberia, unquote.
Within a few minutes of the declaration of war, the 18th had hit the Baku oil fields. Atom bombs, more powerful than the types dropped on Japan, smashed the main pipeline systems. Hundreds of wells were wrecked. Then succeeding waves of planes dropped napalm incendiary bombs until the oil-soiled ground of Baku roared into flames. The city was a smoking, demolished, gutted ruin.
Optimism over the initial success of the bombing evaporates as Soviet forces launch an invasion of Europe and Manchuria. Craig flies into Germany to report on American forces being pushed back with heavy losses there and in Austria. The situation becomes desperate enough that the general in charge appeals to the German people for, quote, help for the defenders of Western civilization against your old enemy, Russian Bolshevism, unquote. This appeal has the effect of angering practically all of Europe, which is still recovering from the destruction wrought by the Third Reich, and which the Soviet Union quickly takes advantage of in a propaganda coup. Craig ascribes the ability of the Soviet Union to survive the initial nuclear strike and still counterattack with overwhelming force to grim determination.
To begin with, as our own survival shows, people can withstand great punishment. Somehow, even in cities 3/4 wrecked, life goes on. People go back to a standard of living reminiscent of ancient barbarism. They live 6 in a room, own and can hope to own nothing but what is on their own backs, and they are always hungry. But the most essential war tasks get done. Supplies are moved, Troops are shifted from one place to another and so on, if necessary by the most primitive means. There is doubtless a point beyond which men and women rebel or just break down. However, it takes a long time for our tough people to reach that.
Craig attends a military briefing about an attack on the Balkans and the Caucasus from bases in Turkey which have had some success. Craig then flies to Korea, where he is informed the Red Army invasion of Manchuria is stalled, while an American attack towards Vladivostok has gained little ground. Craig takes a hotel room in Seoul just before another far larger Soviet attack hits, and he is forced to retreat along with the American forces. The military is eventually evacuated from Busan while protected by air power stationed in Japan. Craig sails out to cover fighting at the American beachhead near Vladivostok, which includes the first use of chemical weapons by the Soviets. After several days, the press is ordered to evacuate before the American forces abandon the beachhead, and Craig returns to New York. The American military, frustrated by their inability to force a surrender with continued nuclear attacks on the Soviet Union and with conventional forces stalled in the Caucasus, make the decision to use a chemical attack on the Ukrainian wheat fields in the hope of starving the Soviets. The novel mentions a real project undertaken during the Second World War, where the United States considered poisoning the rice crop in Japan using a substance called TN8. The idea was to starve the military of provisions and force the population to surrender. The project was shelved as it risked killing millions and would have made occupation, which required feeding the population, practically impossible. As Craig is about to board a flight to Alaska, he is informed that the news station has lost contact with Washington, then New York, Detroit, and finally Pittsburgh. While Craig is reading the bulletins, Chicago is also hit, wrecking the building and cutting off all power. The station manager orders Craig to investigate the damage.
I think it may even be necessary to institute a sort of precautionary arrest to keep potential troublemakers out of circulation. I wouldn't be surprised if a domestic mail censorship were instituted before long. Army men will certainly have to be put into every civilian organization, including unions, to be sure there will be no thinking that may lead to trouble.
Craig walks around the city, interviewing police, fire, and medical officials trying to deal with the damage, and noting the destruction before returning to the news station. The novel mentions John Hershey's Hiroshima, which was published in its entirety in The New Yorker and drastically changed American perceptions of the atomic bombing of Japan. Craig is sent back out to gather more news and sees long streams of refugees leaving the city and conducts interviews with the survivors. The affected area is described as 3 square miles, essentially wiping out the loop in some of the west side, killing thousands. Craig comes upon a hastily constructed military camp where the general in charge seconds him to fly to Army headquarters and make a report on what he's seen. During the flight, Craig learns that the Soviet bombers managed to cross the Arctic and get through to Chicago while New York and Washington were hit by submarine-launched missiles. The plane lands in Cincinnati, where there are thousands trying to flee the city. Eventually, Craig is able to make it through to Army headquarters to give his report. He asks what will be done for the continuing war production in view of the ongoing panic, and is informed the military is imposing blackouts and curfews, and will also enact martial law.
I think it may even be necessary to institute a sort of precautionary arrest to keep potential troublemakers out of circulation. I wouldn't be surprised if a domestic mail censorship were instituted before long. Army men will certainly have to be put into every civilian organization, including unions, to be sure there will be no thinking that may lead to trouble.
The general expects Craig and all the other journalists to sell the American people on these new restrictions, that the press will act as a propaganda arm of the government. After the meeting, Craig accepts an invitation to attend a demonstration of a new counter-battery missile capable of intercepting nuclear bombs, though not other missiles. Craig then heads to El Paso after the test and rents a room, but is woken in the middle of the night by an explosion. Outside, people are in a panic, suspecting they are under attack. After calling around, Craig discovers the explosion was due to a malfunctioning test rocket from Fort Bliss, but it's too late to save the people who were injured in the race to get out of the city and, ironically, flee into Mexico.
Immediately after the El Paso panic, martial law, as the general had indicated, was declared throughout the country. Army men were placed in all key communication centers, in every business establishment employing more than 100 people, and all trade union headquarters. To maintain production at as high a level as possible, the Army also rushed through its entire civilian defense plan, including the immediate evacuation of all non-essential civilians from the cities.
Major industrial plants, nuclear power stations, and other wartime production facilities are moved underground. Rationing is instituted, and even prohibition is brought back. The Soviets continue to attack the United States with submarine-launched missiles, destroying Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, Los Angeles, Portland, San Francisco, and Seattle, among other cities. There is some success in countering the threat when the Navy develops magnetic airborne detectors that can help locate the submarines. Meanwhile, the authorities foil a Soviet effort to destroy the uranium mine at Bear Lake, which supplies most of the fissionable material for the weapons program. The military also finds that the Soviets have established forward bases in northern Canada and manages to wipe them out. As winter arrives, a consequence of rationing is that there are few newspapers and almost no books being published anymore. In its place, the Army creates public radio posts that disseminate approved news. The deepening crisis results in a major political event.
Then, in the last week of April, Congress itself passed a resolution that was quickly translated into an executive order, announcing that the 82nd Congress would continue in existence with the approval of the President, until it was dissolved by the joining action of the President and the Speaker of the House, until such time it was to be considered in session, whether or not it actually met.
As the war continues, there are further exchanges of nuclear weapons. The Americans launch an attack on Nizhny-Kolmysk, while the British attack Murmansk. The British suffered terrible losses, made worse when the Soviets set fire to the sea which they had coated with oil. The novel points out the British had planned to hamper the feared German invasion of the United Kingdom during the Second World War using a similar method. The American assault also fails, though due more to hostile freezing temperatures than enemy action. The Soviets publicly announce that they have hit America with germ warfare in retaliation for the chemical attack on Ukraine. Soon after, a new form of influenza starts spreading in Minnesota and affects the western states, sabotaging food production. Craig takes a tour of the hospital that is trying to handle the influx of sick people and learns that many of the afflicted will never fully recover. This section of the novel, for anyone who has lived through the COVID outbreak, makes for unpleasantly familiar reading, especially how it kills 700,000 people and incapacitates almost 2 million. The United States retaliates with more germ warfare, first with an aerosol version of Pasteurella pestis, more popularly known as the Black Death, then with asphytic cholera that is sprayed into the drinking water, and finally a hormone designed to destroy the Soviet potato crop. The Soviets reply with a variety of rust and bacterial rots that causes shortages both on the home front and for frontline troops. Craig goes to cover the fighting in the Caucasus just in time to watch the Soviet military force the American army to abandon the beachhead and retreat back to Turkey. Craig returns to the United States and tours Los Angeles and Washington. The capital is surprisingly not obliterated, with most buildings damaged but still standing. Other places are not so lucky.
The Moscow radio boasted of the many Soviet pronouncements friendly to the colonial peoples and urged them to strike now for independence. But the colonial peoples needed no outside encouragement. Here was a white-hot opportunity to end the outmoded colonial system, to throw off the rule of the Europeans. The colonies seized it. The tide of rebellion spread even beyond the British Empire. It would be futile to pretend that this revolt of the colonial peoples was without effect on our position. For one thing, it rapidly assumed potentially dangerous overtones of an anti-white crusade.
Craig tours the ruins and interviews survivors who describe the reduced hours of available electricity, queuing for rations, few telephone lines, no hot water, scars from outbreaks of disease, and everyone required to carry gas masks in case of another Soviet attack. Craig also discovers a black market for cigarettes and ways for people to get around rationing. In Los Angeles, Craig takes a tour of a catalytic oil cracking facility that's been installed in the San Gabriel Mountains to protect it from attack. The underground plant is described in glowing terms with furnishings, advanced air circulation, a hospital, cafeteria, and other amenities. On the war front, Britain installs new missiles called the Kremlin Express that can cover 1,500 miles to deliver their nuclear payloads. Only a few of these are launched, however, before the Soviet Union retaliates by seeking merchant shipping to starve Britain, while also dropping dozens of nuclear bombs every day on its remaining cities. Eventually, the government falls and is replaced by a Labour government that effectively surrenders. The fall of the British Empire presages a wave of unrest and rebellion across the globe.
The Moscow radio boasted of the many Soviet pronouncements friendly to the colonial peoples and urged them to strike now for independence. But the colonial peoples needed no outside encouragement. Here was a white-hot opportunity to end the outmoded colonial system, to throw off the rule of the Europeans. The colonies seized it. The tide of rebellion spread even beyond the British Empire. It would be futile to pretend that this revolt of the colonial peoples was without effect on our position. For one thing, it rapidly assumed potentially dangerous overtones of an anti-white crusade.
India, Malaysia, Burma, Indochina, and the, quote, Muslim governments in the Middle East force or demand the removal of all occupying troops. After these anti-colonial revolutions, the world settles into a stalemate, with the Soviets having repulsed multiple invasions but too devastated to launch a large campaign. The United States, with only bases in Alaska, Japan, and some in the Middle East, has essentially been reduced to an isolated fortress. Each side relies more and more on virus and bacteriological attacks, but while these cause immense suffering, none force a surrender.
Here again, however, our respite was short-lived. As throughout this war, and all other wars, when one offensive weapon fails, people and armies to others more destructive, more terrible. In this case, it was the radioactive dust which we have since had to struggle against, and which we have used with equal force and effect against the Soviets. When finally radioactive dust were used this fall, many asked why they had not been employed earlier. The answer is simply that neither side wished to take the fearful responsibility of initiating this kind of war, and both sides feared retaliation. We, on humanitarian grounds, earnestly desire to hold back just as long as possible. For radio dust poison not only the present, but the future as well. They incapacitate and kill not only the living, but also those who are yet to be born.
Both sides attack with radioactive clouds that somehow give off X-rays that cause sterility, miscarriages, and mutations, sickening thousands and killing thousands more. The United States develops limited treatments through radiation therapy and a radon ointment that prevents the population from being annihilated, but the long-term damage is described in grim tones. The epilogue provides a short summation of the conflict, noting that 35 million Americans have died. 1/5 of the housing stock has been destroyed, along with most of the rail network and industrial capacity. The report ends by imploring the reader that all Americans must work together and as hard as possible to survive and try to win the war, though there is no guarantee and no end in sight. World Aflame's narrative design takes inspiration from Why We Fight, a series of 7 films created by Frank Capra in the U.S. War Department that ran from 1942 to 1945. Initially shown only to soldiers drafted into the armed forces to explain the history of the conflict and justify the decision to go to war, they would eventually be screened for the public. Officials in the War Department were acutely aware of the ability of writers and journalists to sway public opinion. Pearl Buck's pre-war novel, The Good Earth, had created widespread sympathy to China's plight and created the pressure to send arms and supplies when they were attacked by Japan. Throughout the Second World War, journalists were often contracted by the State or War Department for special projects before returning to their newspapers. In the novel, the war stems from a flashpoint between American and Soviet forces in Turkey and Iran, which is based on real events. In 1945, the Soviets had pressured Turkey to cede them several chunks of territory, including Alashkert, eastern Lazistan, and the Kars Plateau. In Iran, the Soviets had refused to withdraw on the agreed timeline set at Potsdam, and instead created 2 breakaway provinces, the Azerbaijan's People's Government and the Republic of Mahabad. The United States exerted political pressure on the Soviet Union to withdraw from Iran, and eventually supported Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in sending the army to retake both provinces and dismantle the governments. Using a real event as a stepping stone to demonstrate how a relatively small event could escalate reflected a growing concern among the public. There was still major fighting going on across the globe, but Cold War politics meant that tensions in places often relegated to the back pages of the major newspapers could spiral out of control. Although set in the future, the nuclear aspects are extrapolated from the thinking at that time. When the novel was published, the United States only had 32 nuclear weapons with an average yield of 23 kilotons. No one had envisioned that in a few decades, the United States and the Soviet Union would have thousands of nuclear weapons with yields in the hundreds of kilotons. As such, people thought a nuclear war, while devastating, could be endured. This was at odds with strategic planners who thought that a full nuclear strike could force an enemy to surrender. Part of this stemmed from the mistaken belief that the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan had ended the Pacific War, rather than them being the end of a series of pressures that caused the Japanese government and military to concede. Another part was the fixation of military officers such as Royal Air Force Marshal Arthur Harris and Air Force General Curtis LeMay. Both insisted that large-scale strategic bombing could damage an enemy enough to force them to surrender. They made this claim despite direct contradictory evidence that accumulated throughout the war. Cities like St. Petersburg and Stalingrad were able to resist overwhelming military force and remain socially cohesive despite appalling conditions of starvation, along with constant bombing and shelling. While bombing could degrade production and depress morale, it failed to effect a surrender at a local or a national level. Neither Germany or England had collapsed under severe bombing campaigns. This reality was noted in the United States Air Force, Army, and Navy report. This reality was noted in a United States Air Force, Army, and Navy report led by Lieutenant General Hubert R. Harmon that estimated a first strike would cause 3 million Soviet fatalities and another 4 million casualties, but, quote, the atomic offensive would not per se bring about the capitulation, destroy the roots of communism, or critically weaken the power of the Soviet leadership to dominate the people, unquote. The novel reflects this as neither the United States nor the Soviet Union surrenders when nuclear weapons are used. Instead, they become merely another part of the violence as both nations deploy chemical and biological weapons, and people adjust to them similar to how they adjusted to a conventional war. Industries are moved away from cities and in some cases underground. The government takes command of the allocation of resources, and emergency stations are built. Decentralization would become a popular topic in defense industry circles and among strategic planners. It would serve as part of the justification for the highway system, although more exotic ideas like ring cities were eventually shelved. The novel is notable for describing how radiation can cause hereditary damage, something suggested by scientists studying survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Committee on Atomic Casualties of the U.S. National Research Council would publicly state that there was cause to infer genetic effects caused by radiation, though they cautioned the evidence was not yet conclusive. The novel also describes radiation poisoning of people and land caused by the fallout from nuclear weapons. Fallout had become a widely discussed issue after the Operation Crosswind tests had demonstrated how ships not directly hit by the blast became contaminated with irradiated particles. Beyond the physical damage, the novel also emphasizes the systematic dismantling of civil liberties during wartime. During the First and Second World War, the government routinely inspected and censored mail from military personnel, labor organizers, activists, anti-war protesters, and other critics who were arrested on trumped-up charges and often jailed. The day after Pearl Harbor, the president gave J. Edgar Hoover emergency powers to censor news, mail, radio, and telephone communications. Meanwhile, the Alien Registration Act would be broadly interpreted during and after the war to imprison dissenters. Most infamously, thousands of American citizens of Japanese descent were arrested and placed in concentration camps. The novel expands on these precedents by describing government propaganda, widespread censorship, military personnel placed in organizations, especially unions, to prevent dissent, and finally the end of democracy itself. Some of the actions taken are technically not possible. The Constitution allows for Congress to postpone an election, but requires it to change the laws that regulate the date of the election both at the federal and state level. There's a limitation in the 20th Amendment that states the president and vice president terms end at 4 years, even if no election has happened, in which case they are succeeded by the Speaker of the House who becomes acting president. However, it is easy to imagine a scenario where these laws are ignored. This dismantling is connected to a much darker comment when the general contracting Craig tells him that the American people must be prepared for a total war. This is a reference to Joseph Goebbels' speech at the Sportspalast in 1943, where he called on the German people to believe in a total war. In 1945, E.A. Pillar published Time Bomb, America's Sinister New Fascism, which examined fascist organizations in the United States, such as the Committee for Constitutional Government, the Christian American, and the America First Party. He warned that these organizations were advocating white supremacy, religious discrimination, anti-Semitism, and class warfare, that they were attracting followers and were making inroads into positions of power in the government. World Aflame serves as a warning of the horrors of nuclear war and the dangers at home, that the values America stood for could be stripped away. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.